Hey there everybody, in this video I'm going to talk about the difference between steeping grains and mashing them. This is for all of you malt extract brewers who are going all grain and are completely bewildered by the idea of mashing. So I'll explain the similarities and differences, and you'll see that by having that background of steeping grains in malt extract brewing, you have a pretty good foundation for mashing. Now let's talk about why you steep and why you mash. And I really want to emphasize that the main difference between these two things is not so much in the process, not so much in the steps that you take. The main difference is in the result. It's what's happening in the kettle and the chemistry involved. And that leads us into our first bullet. Steeping is really an extraction process. You're extracting color, flavor, and some sugars out of the grains. There's really nothing too complicated going on there, and it's a lot like steeping tea. Mashing, on the other hand, is more of a conversion process. There are enzymes involved in converting starches to sugar, and that's the main purpose of mashing, is to get sugar out of the grain. And there is also some extraction going on because you are going to get color and flavor out of the grains, but it's mainly a conversion process. In steeping, you only steep specialty malts without starches. In general, these are your darker grains, and I'll name those later. But you might be wondering, since we do extract sugar, where that sugar comes from if we're not mashing. Well, it actually happens at the maltster. When you kiln and roast grain enough, you actually convert starches to sugar during that process. So there was a conversion process for the specialty grains, but it happened at the maltster, not in your mash tun. In mashing, on the other hand, you use base grains, and these are grains that have not been processed as much as specialty grains, so it's your job to convert the starches to sugars in the mash tun. And you also include the specialty malts when you mash, because that will extract all that other character. The conditions while steeping are not as critical. You have some pretty broad ranges to work within. In mashing, on the other hand, the conditions are very important, and I'll talk about some of those in a sec. Now, what steeping and mashing do have in common is that before you start, you need to mill your grains. You need to crack open the husk of the grain to get at the inside. And you can do this at the Homebrew store or on your own if you own a grain mill. So let's look at steeping first, and I'll show you an example. This is the process that I recommend for Homebrew Academy members. You put your grains into a grain bag. You use 2 to 4 gallons of water at 150 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit and steep for 30 minutes. The most common grains used, these specialty grains, are crystal malt, roasted barley, black patent, victory, carafa, honey malt, chocolate malt, and there are some other ones as well. And this is what steeping looks like. We're using a smaller pot on our stovetop. We have our specialty grains in a grain bag, and the temperature is between 150 and 170. We hold it there for 30 minutes, remove the grain bag, and then bring the wort to a boil. Now let's look at mashing. For the process, you start out by adding your grains to the mash tun, and the most common way to do this is to add your grains to the hot water as opposed to vice versa. And the water to grain ratio is much more important in mashing than steeping. You want to try to stay between 1.25 to 2 quarts of water per pound of grain. You mash for 1 hour between 145 and 157 degrees Fahrenheit. And the temperature really depends on your desired sugar profile. So if you mash at the lower end of that spectrum, you're going to have a more fermentable wort and you'll wind up with a thinner, lighter bodied beer. If you mash at the higher end, you're going to have a less fermentable wort and a fuller bodied beer. The pH of the mash needs to stay between 5.2 and 5.5 for the enzymes to work properly. And that's something you really don't have to worry about as much in steeping. And you can control the pH by using brewing salts and understanding your water chemistry. Finally, in mashing, depending on the style of beer that you're making, you might need to use multiple mash rests. So you might do a rest at 120 degrees before bringing it up to 152 degrees. But for the most part, a single infusion mash works fine for the vast majority of your beers, and you don't have to worry about multiple rests. For the grains that we use in mashing, all the specialty grains that were listed earlier are included, plus all of these base malts and adjuncts. Two-row, pale malt, Munich, Vienna, and the adjuncts like flaked wheat and barley, oats, and rye. Now let's look at a mashing process on my system. I start out with all my grains milled, base malts and specialty malts included. This is my mash tun with a false bottom. I use a ratio of 1.75 quarts of water per pound of grain, and I heat that to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and I want to end up at 152 degrees when I add the grains. I use brewing software to figure out that I need 160. Then once the mash water hits 160, I slowly add my grains to it. Then once the grains are added, you need to mix them in to break up any dough balls that may be trapping sugars, and you do this for a couple of minutes. You could use a spoon, but I'm lazy, so I like to use this motorized paint stirrer. Then 1 hour later, at the end of the mash, you perform a step called a Vorlauf. That's where you recirculate out of the bottom of the mash tun and back to the top to filter out any grain particles that got through the false bottom. I do this step using a pump. I pump from the bottom of the mash tun back in through the top, but you don't need to use a pump. The way I did it for years, and a great way to do it, is to simply drain out of the mash tun using gravity into a pitcher, and then dump the wort back onto the top of the grain bed. And do this until the wort runs clear and it's free of grain. It usually takes 3 to 4 times. So that's the mash. Once it's over, our starches are converted to sugars and we can begin the sparging process. But that's a topic for another lesson. So I hope this helped to explain the difference between steeping and mashing. Like I said earlier, the main difference is in the purpose, not the process. Because at the end of the day, in both of them, we're just soaking grains in hot water. But with mashing, it's a conversion process, whereas with steeping, it's an extraction process. If you remember that, you'll be good to go.